My name is Ruth Goldman. I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the year 1965. So-called race riots were taking place all over the country, but it wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that someone told me I was the product of a mixed marriage. It's not what you think, though. This is my mother's family, Eastern European Jews from Lithuania and Austria, who immigrated to this country in the late 1800s. And this is my father's family, German Jews, who immigrated to this country in the mid-1800s. Just to clarify, my mother's family were Eastern European Jews, and my father's family were German Jews. 40 years and a couple hundred miles doesn't seem like much, but you'd be surprised.
The differences. When the Eastern European Jews came over, they didn't want to assimilate. The German Jews' goal was to assimilate. They might have as well not have been on the same planet.
We used to decorate our Christmas tree, and the rabbi's sons used to come up and help.
My best friends are Jewish people, but I was very much against the whole Jewish group who just did nothing but Jewish fundraising for Jewish causes.
The German Jews founded every major institution in the city. They were the only ones that were here. That's why they did it.
That was important for me as a kid, to try to be part of the general community.
My great-grandfather was anti-Zionist, as were a lot of the rabbis at that time.
It tended to be confusing. How could you be proud of being Jewish when at the same time the message was, keep a low profile, don't make anything of it.
You were kike if you were a Jew that you didn't think was any good.
I asked Grandma why she celebrated Christmas and Easter, and she said that's the way she was brought up. I often said early on that mine was a mixed marriage, because in Cincinnati terms, it was.
I forgot about that mixed marriage comment until 10 years later when my cousin Roger was telling me about going to Cincinnati as a child.
I was sent by my parents to Cincinnati to participate in the Christmas parties. 2 solid weeks of parties, morning, noon, and night, without stopping. It was almost a Victorian system.
And this was a bunch of Jews?
Not a bunch of Jews. They were all German Jews.
German Jews.
Do not ever say Jews. It's only German Jews.
So I decided to return to Cincinnati to find out more about my German-American Jewish roots.
Rich, 1927. Cincinnati families have been the chief providers of marriageable human stock for the Jewish elite throughout the country. As a source of yichus, they are not unlike some of the royal families of Europe. To them, one can trace the genealogy of many of the prominent Jewish families in America.
It was a different kind of culture. I mean, Eastern European Jews were totally cultured in Jewish and rabbinic and learning. I mean, the German Jews couldn't hold a candle to them in that, but they were more cultured to Goethe and Schilling and all those kinds of things. They weren't necessarily, it wasn't Jewish. They thought they were Germans.
On both sides, my father's side and my mother's side, it was about the same time. In the 1840s, lots of Germans came to the United States because they wanted to avoid military service in Germany. And so there was an exodus, especially to Cincinnati, because it reminded them of their homeland, the Rhineland. The river and the hills looked like Germany. So it wasn't just a Jewish movement, it was a German movement.
The German Jewish community, many of them brought over with them the cultural pattern that they were accustomed to in Germany. And that was one where they were Germans first, and my maternal grandfather even said if Hitler didn't do what he did to the Jews, he'd be wonderful because he's doing so much for Germany.
I think those were the most assimilated people, and I guess that's what it meant. It meant that you were not different. I think people were very afraid of being different.
And this was more or less the attitude of a large number of people. Not so much being pro-German, but saying I'm an American first.
It's important to be Jewish, but it's also important to be part of the American system, be assimilated. That was deeply embedded into to me as a kid.
I am an American first, but I am a Jew.
He came and took me ice skating and took me to his house for hot chocolate afterwards. They had a Christmas tree, which was very funny because I had always thought he was Jewish, and I began to wonder.
Cincinnati was known for its very, very gala Christmas parties among the German Jewish upper echelon accepted group, but we also went to a lot of the Christian parties. So it was I never thought of it as being a Jewish thing not to do. It was there. This was our life. We were integrated. We were the kind of people that would have thought if Hitler had come along, we wouldn't be taken because we had so many good Christian friends.
It never occurred to me that Jewish people weren't supposed to have a Christmas tree. When I went to Walnut Hills and made Jewish friends, they were all really amazed that I had a Christmas tree. And I remember they would come to my house and help trim it because they had never trimmed a Christmas tree before. As obviously I've matured, I understand that this was really a very German Jewish thing in Cincinnati, that most people that I know today did not have Christmas trees and still look at me and say, what do you mean you had a Christmas tree?
Every Christmas we were invited to the home of relatives of my stepfather to sit around their Christmas tree and they all wished each other Merry Christmas, and they passed out presents, and they were acting as if this was their holiday, and they were all very happy to celebrate the season. It was uncomfortable for me, but all right, why not? They were relatives. Until I had children. And the last time I went was when my first child was an infant. When we were invited the next year, I didn't want to hurt their feelings, but I had to tell them no, that this year he would be old enough to understand, and that he just wouldn't be able to catch on to how a Jewish family would be going to another Jewish family's house to celebrate Christmas.
Religion is the weakest point of these Jews, just as worldly culture is the strongest. For being liberals and professing ideas which logically lead to a denial of all church forms and dogmas, they content themselves with a dry, perfunctory, and rational formula of religion devoid of emotionalism, symbolism, or mysticism.
Although the practices described might seem strange to us today, they were part of what some American Jews in the late 19th and early 20th century viewed as the truly progressive tenets of classical Reform Judaism. Isaac M. Wise, a German-educated American immigrant and one of the leaders of American Reform Judaism, was the rabbi for almost 50 years of Cincinnati's congregation KK B'nai Yeshurun, which later was more commonly known by Wise's name. Wise also founded Hebrew Union College and the Reform Rabbinical Association, and presided over the 1885 Pittsburgh Platform, where American Reform rabbis defined what became classical Reform Judaism. although many Eastern European Jews were involved in classical Reform Judaism. Because it was a transplant from Germany, its earliest proponents were German American Jews, and so the two, especially in Cincinnati, became intertwined.
And we were all trying to get integrated into the community. And what I don't know, and what is interesting to me, and maybe your research will uncover, is whether this was a conscious act to mask our Jewishness and just get lost, or whether people just didn't feel that the religion was something that was externalized, that they felt that it was something that, and how they treated people and their own sort of philosophical ideas of the Jewish heritage, and it didn't have to be mezuzahs on the door and wearing yarmulkes to service and things like that.
Do you remember much about Sunday school?
I liked it. We had sort of a smattering of Hebrew, and we learned about the holidays, but since there was no reinforcement whatsoever at home, we never had a Friday night. I never saw a challah. The first Seder I ever went to was after I was married.
Many people did not know any Hebrew. It simply wasn't important to them.
I don't want to go there and hear Hebrew. I want it to be English. And I do have a feeling about that. Not that I object if other people want to go there and do it. I just don't want to. But I hope at my funeral it is all English. Put that down in the book.
When we were married, we asked Jim Heller to leave out the Hebrew because they could be telling us to go to the devil. We wouldn't know the difference. We just wanted English spoken.
In those days, he was called Reverend Rosenau, Reverend William Rosenau. Because that was, again, I think part of the being more like a minister versus a rabbi. And actually, I think in the Old Union Prayer Book, it refers to minister versus rabbi in parts of the service where the reader is the rabbi and not the congregation. But he was called Reverend Dr. William Rosenau.
My stepfather belonged to the Wise Temple, and so we joined there. My impressions when I first went, I thought it was beautiful. I thought I'd been to many church services with my friends in Detroit, and I always thought they were beautiful. And I didn't see where this differed very much from that. It didn't seem a particle Jewish to me.
Well, they were sort of like church services, choirs, and you've seen pictures of the old services.
There were no yarmulkes or...
Oh, please. I think they were probably forbidden. I have no idea, but never.
One of the children in one of my son's classes at Wise Temple some years later, but still in this dreadful period, they had an old grandpa in New York. And this grandpa, I would guess, didn't take off his yarmulke even to shower. I mean, this is part of his being. And they told him he couldn't sit on the bima at his grandchild's bar mitzvah unless he didn't wear the yarmulke.
Around the turn of the century, I think he really was the belief, as were most rabbis at that time, is that you were American first. And so his allegiance was to America. He instituted English in all of the services in Baltimore at that time.
When I married a man from an Orthodox family, a man from New Haven. He wasn't a practicing Orthodox Jew, but his parents were. And so for the wedding ceremony, my parents spoke to the rabbi at Rockdale, who was Victor Reichert, and who was the rabbi I grew up with and loved, and asked him if he would tailor the ceremony just a little bit so that the people from the Orthodox side of the family would be comfortable, maybe throw in a little more Hebrew, that kind of thing. And then at the end, we were to break a glass. And at the rehearsal the day before the wedding, we got to that part and Bert my then fiance said something about breaking the glass, and Rabbi Reichert said, "Oh, we won't do that. It's a barbaric ritual." But I was totally dismayed because I knew it was important to the Orthodox members of the family. So I ran home and told my father, and he got on the phone with Rabbi Reichert, and they discussed this amicably. And the next afternoon at the wedding, we had the ceremony, and then Rabbi Reichert produced the glass that my mother had supplied, wrapped in a napkin, and he was very gracious about it, extremely. So everybody was happy. But, you know, I think some of those rituals were difficult for him because he was a strict Reform rabbi.
They were very much like a book review. They were very sterile. No Hebrew, no bar mitzvahs.
When we were kids, when your father was, and he was only slightly older than I never even heard of it. I mean, I'd heard of it, but I wasn't sure what it was.
When I told my mother, because I really didn't know what it was, I said, she didn't hear it completely. I said to her, Jim is going to have a bar mitzvah, and she thought I said, Jim, I think Jim has a bar mitzvah, and she said, you'd better get him to a dermatologist. I'm sure he can help.
By the time I had children and I heard about bar mitzvahs, there had never been a bar mitzvah in my youth. Then I realized that it was the Eastern European Jews who had always done these things. I don't think the German Jews in Germany were particularly observant in general. I mean, some must have been more observant than others. But my forebears and the forebears of everybody that I knew, because it was so far away, they just came to the United States and assimilated and went on about their business.
This is the 1880 menu from my great-grandparents' wedding reception. Clearly, they did not keep kosher. The so-called treif, the Yiddish word for non-kosher, banquet, was a turning point in American Jewish history. Rabbi Wise's goal was to unite the non-Orthodox elements of American Judaism under one theological seminary, the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. But at the 1883 ordination of the first class of rabbis, the banquet meal inadvertently included shellfish. The fact that 100 years later, mention should be made of the Rosh Hashanah menu at Cincinnati's German Jewish Country Club in the national Jewish magazine Moment illustrates just how strongly this unfortunate accident cemented the reputation of Cincinnati's German Jewish community as anti-Jewish in many traditional Jews' minds.
Not only did they have Christmas for dances and things like that, they had a raw pig on the table as decoration with an apple in its mouth at a Jewish country club.
I remember going to a breakfast at Aunt Duffy's house one time, and there was a ham. Breakfast with a ham.
When I was at Walnut Hills in the 7th grade, and I had lunch in the cafeteria, I ordered a ham sandwich. And the fellow standing behind me, Sam Krebs, he said, Joe, he said, you can't have a ham sandwich. I said, why not, Sam? He says, Jews don't eat ham. I said, I have a ham and Swiss cheese sandwich almost every other day.
My father sold whiskey, and he was not tall. And his father, my grandfather Westheimer, took him downtown and said, Leo, I want to give you something, but don't tell your mother. There's nothing wrong with it. And he gave him ham and bacon and all kinds of pork. And he said, don't say anything to your mother about it. But it's hard enough for you to be a Jew and not tall, not big, selling whiskey to tough people without being different.
Their estrangement from Gentiles on the one hand and the Jews of Eastern Europe on the other, curiously enough, has added to the esteem in which the Cincinnati Jewish 400 are held by both. Very few of them are members of any exclusive Gentile clubs. Those that are have been invited to become such. The Avondale Jews have their own clubs, their own salons, their own societies, their own schools, their own temples, and even their own summering places.
The German Jews looked down on Russian Jews, on Polish Jews. I can remember when Helen Iglauer, who was my first cousin, her mother and my mother were sisters. I have a picture of them here. Oh, you can't see it. It's a tintype. Helen was going with Nelson, and Nelson Glick was a Russian Jew. And my grandmother sat up and said, "Who is he?" And Helen said, "Mommy, it isn't who is he, it's what is he."
Mother took my sister and me out to the country club to go swimming, which was fine. And we were in the pool. Now, my mother doesn't swim. My mother does a little side stroke back and forth across the shallow end of the pool, but that's about all the swimming she does. And ever since the time when she fell through the ice in Petoskey and was rescued by an Indian, she's been afraid of water. She's really genuinely afraid of deep water. But she saw the son of one of the prominent German Jewish families on the diving board. And she called to him, "Oh, Ira! Ira! Hello!" And he said, "Oh, hello." But he didn't hear her after that. "Hello, Ira, this is my daughter, Beth." Well, he didn't hear her. So my mother, my poor mother, hand over hand along the side of the pool to the deep end so she could say, "Ira, I want you to meet my daughter, Beth. Here she is." That was the extent that she would have gone to get me to marry a German Jewish fellow.
I remember very much in high school being very much a part of the school, but realizing that there was a big dividing line between the Jewish people and the non-Jews. There were Gentile fraternities, and they would have no Jews. And on the other hand, I was very conscious as I went to high school that the German Jewish boys and girls stuck together, and the Jewish kids who were not German Jewish were really not accepted by that. It's hard for people to understand that today. That's absolutely gone. But that was very deep with me.
In high school, the division really began because they had sororities and fraternities. I don't know how many Gentile sororities there were, a couple, but there were 3 Jewish sororities. One was Reform, one was Conservative, and one was Orthodox, which is just, sort of shocking when you think back on that. And the division was clearly along the religious separations, but it was a class division as well, a status division. I mean, the sorority to be in was the Reform Jewish sorority. It was called Gamma Kappa.
GK was the Reform Jewish, German Jewish, upper economic and social Jewish group of people, all of whom, without exception, I believe, parents belonged to the Losantiville Country Club. My mother had married a man who came from a German background. And that gave us entree into all the goodies of Cincinnati.
When I finished the 5th grade at North Avondale School, The 6th grade was at Avondale School, Rockdale Reading Road. And a lot of the families that had immigrated to the United States after World War I lived in South Avondale, so a lot of their kids were going to school there. And I made friends with them. My birthday was in October, and I remember Mother said I could have a birthday party. So I invited some of the friends that I'd met at Avondale School to the birthday party. When I told Mother about them, she wanted me to have invited other kids, the ones that she would like me to associate, the university school crowd, so to speak. And she said, if you can't have those other children, you're going to have the ones I want you to have. I said, no, she, and if you don't tell me you made a mistake, you can't have a party. I said, I don't want a birthday party then, and I didn't. But that was really the first confrontation that I recall having with my folks about it, and that left it was an indelible scar. I felt awfully bad about it.
My sister died in 1951, and people were coming to our house to pay condolence calls. And Rabbi Eliezer Silver, who was the head of the Orthodox Jewish community at the time, who my father worshipped, came to pay a condolence call. Now, he walked into the house, and my mother put out her hand to shake his hand, and he wouldn't shake her hand because she was a woman, and you know, the whole taboos and all. She was wild. She was so upset. I mean, her daughter had died, but she was upset at this man who would not, she couldn't understand why, you know, it was so foreign to her.
Mother was very, talked about that a fair amount. If we would drive, coming home from temple, if we drive by an Orthodox temple, people were standing outside talking. They tended to be more, I really can't come up with the right word, more talkative, more vibrant. She felt that was bad, she would say that makes it bad for us. I realize now that what she was dealing with was a profound need to assimilate. It was survival, and it was uncomfortable for me at the time. It seemed very snobbish, but I think they felt very much at risk, and that was the need to assimilate, to keep a low profile, to be just not make trouble and not have anybody else make trouble for us.
When we, my sister and I, registered at Walnut Hills, she registered us as Smiley, not as Smilansky. This was to get rid of the stigma of the Eastern European name, but she didn't just come out of the blue with this. My uncles had taken Smiley instead of Smilansky. Only my father retained the old name. And even my brother, my half-brother, took Smiley instead of Smilansky. So that Smiley was the obvious name to take. And she registered us at high school with that name. I didn't pay any attention to it. I was all right. I was Beth Smiley at high school. That was fine. There were the reasons, I knew what her reasons were even then. They perhaps she may have given some other reason, but I knew. I mean, it wasn't that the name wasn't pretty enough or hard to learn. I knew what it was. But I forgot about it until graduation. And it became very important at that point, although I had no recollection of it. I came down the aisle having graduated and expecting to be hugged, kissed, and congratulated. And instead I found a very angry mother who said, well, how could you have done it to me? And I had not the vaguest idea what she meant. But I found out when she held the graduation program in front of my face and said, see, look, look. I still didn't know. And then she opened it up and pointed to my name, and it said Beth Smilansky, Beth Maxine Smilansky. She said, how could you have done that to me? And I realized what had happened. Right after the Christmas break, there was a sign outside the office of the principal that said, if you are going under any other name, any pseudonym, if your name is Robert and we've been calling you Bobby, please come in. Your high school graduation certificate is a legal document. We need your real name. So I came in, told them, and forgot about it. Only it mattered to my mother a great deal because of this German Eastern European split in the Jewish community.
Do you think your parents' identity as Jews was different than Dad's family?
Well, they had been brought up by people who had come to this country, who had suffered a great deal of discrimination where they had grown up, and they were very happy to be here in a free country where they were not threatened, and where they could practice their religion without suffering for it. And they could get ahead in the world. That's very different than Dad's parents, who had grown up as the third or fourth generation of people who had, to a certain extent, had it made already.
Religion did not play a large part in our lives in any emotional way. In a societal way, we felt that being Reform was being elite, and that was kind of interchangeable with being German Jews.
I was very aware of the fact that I was Jewish, and that people tried not to pretend they weren't Jewish, but you didn't make a statement about it. You wanted to assimilate, sort of fade into the woodwork. When I was in junior high school, I knew about the sororities and fraternities in high school, but this was 7th and 8th grade. But I do remember being invited to a dance in the 8th grade by a boy who was not Jewish. And he ended up having to call me and rescind the invitation because his parents didn't want him going out with a Jewish girl.
Walking home from school, we'd get to certain street corners. Families would fight to preserve those corners. And I'd have to fight my way home because Gentile boys would be throwing rocks at us. It happened almost every day. So when I was a kid, before I was 10 years old, I had a strong feeling that of not being wanted in the non-Jewish society, and yet being very anxious to be a part of the general scene.
Bob and I went on a vacation. We didn't have any money, so we stayed in a very inexpensive place and got bicycles to get places. And we came down the first morning we were there, and there was a big sign on it said Gentile clientele only. So we went to them and said, we're Jewish. And they said, oh, it doesn't mean people like you. And we got out. We left. I wouldn't stay in a place but there were many places that Jews were not accepted.
My mother had a brother who lived in Los Angeles. He was in the film industry. And his wife was very anti-Semitic, and he led almost a double life because she did not want anything to do with any of his Jewish friends. Well, of course, the whole industry in Hollywood, all those people were Jewish. So he never brought any of his industry friends home because his wife just didn't like it. And when he died, she made it clear to my mother, her sister-in-law, that she really didn't want any more connection with her because she wrote a letter and said, now my sons can live their lives as true Americans. And what happened is that maybe 30 years later, I met two of her sons. They had no idea their father was Jewish. None. They knew so little about his background, I was shocked. You know, how these grown men could not have known this about their father. So, you know, that was a shock to me. You know, that was anti-Semitism, as close to home as you can get.
Their Jewishness is no deeper than their religion. They admit they have neglected to study or even appreciate their Jewish groundings. But this, they say, is compensated for by their genuine interest in cultural development and social progress, which are the common property of humanity and tend to the mental and spiritual assimilation of all mankind. Assimilation, therefore, has no terror for them. Yet, strangely enough, these very assimilationists who care so little about Jewishness and share practically none of the hopes and aspirations of the Jewish people persist in maintaining their Jewish identity. They stubbornly refuse to intermarry with Gentiles and thus disappear as a racial entity. But time is their greatest enemy. It is working on the side, if not of the Gentiles, then certainly the Jews hailing from Eastern Europe. These Jews are closing in upon the walls of the aristocratic ghetto.
I was 17 when they opened the concentration camps, and that was maybe the most powerful anything that ever happened to me, maybe in my entire life. And so I understood what anti-Semitism is. And by the end of the war, everybody, even the German Jews in Cincinnati, understood what had gone on and how terrible it had been, and started to feel quite differently about being Jewish. Anne Frank was exactly my age, and I always thought that there, but for the grace of God, go I.
Nelson felt that it was important for the boys who were training to be rabbis, and they were all boys at the time the school was built. A short while later, the first girl was admitted.
Nelson Glick.
Nelson Glick, right. That they learn Hebrew in Israel because they could learn it so much better than in the classroom. And so he initiated the first year in Israel. Grandpa certainly was very much for that. And I think that was when the rabbinical students came back from Israel. They'd been exposed to more observant Jews, that they started adopting more of the traditions in the Jewish faith. That also, I think, was a function of being more comfortable in our society as Jews and not feeling threatened. So that's when they started, some of them started wearing yarmulkes and using taluses.
My grandmother, especially, the daughter of Dr. Rosenau, who was very outspoken. My great-grandfather's yard site was always celebrated at Hebrew Union College, and so I would take her for yard site, and one year we went, and it was probably one of the early years after the students came back from Israel, and she looked around, and the student rabbis, it was a daytime service, they all were davening, they all had on taluses, they all had their heads covered, and the service was almost entirely in Hebrew probably at that point in time, and she looked around and in her loud voice said, "This is disgusting."
People of my generation, my age and older, I don't think this applies to anybody younger, really, unless, you know, maybe people in their late 60s. But they want things to be the way they were. That's true with a lot of institutions. You know, older people resist change often. It doesn't bother me that much. I do, you know, accept what I want, and the rest I don't, you know. I mean, I don't feel I have to go to temple or go to synagogue and wear a tallis or a yarmulke, but a lot of people do, and if they want to, fine.
How do you find Reform Judaism today?
Oh, much more conservative, if that's the way to, much more religious might be a much more observant, whatever adjective, and much more meaningful. I mean, you only realize when you see something that you didn't have how it was almost like a brittle shell what we had. There was so little there, and everybody was so busy not ever using any Hebrew other than the Shema. And now it's much more interesting, much more full-blooded, and much more true.
One time I took her to services because I think it was my grandfather's yard site, and it was at the time, it must have been in the early 80s, and Rockdale was starting to do adult bat mitzvahs, adult bar and bat mitzvahs for adults who had never had one and decided that they wanted to learn Hebrew and have a bar and bat mitzvah. And she turned to me, and in her loud voice again, she said to me, "If you ever do this to me, I'll kill you." And so that was really the stand that she took, because I think, again, coming from that classical reform movement as her father was, this was going too far over the edge.
Today, what's it mean to you to be Jewish?
Today is certainly, I am more defensive about it. Today, you can't help but be, because of the tremendous publicity given to anti-Semitism and racial discrimination. When I was growing up, that didn't exist to this extent. So naturally, I'm a Jew. I don't go out and flaunt it. I am not as comfortable with saying it as my late husband would have been or my present husband is. But I don't want to kneel when I go to church. I don't say, Jesus Christ is my God. I'm Jewish, and I have certain very strong feelings that are brought about because of the terrible times that we're living in that don't seem to be getting any better.
It's my culture, my background. And I think I gain a lot of advantages from it. My sense of liberalism, my sense of justice, I think are all involved one way or another with being Jewish.
To me, and I suppose to many people who consider themselves Jewish, the continuity of generations, to feel that this is something that has been going on for so much longer than any one lifespan, and has come on down through the ages, is really very awesome. I hope that it will continue. It gives me comfort.
It means to be different. And yet I don't want to be different. I never have felt different, and yet I'm considered different because I'm Jewish.
I'm an historical Jew. I look upon it as a membership of a distinguished family, starting with Abraham, who got some very good ideas about changing the world as you go through the story of Genesis and Exodus and read the whole Torah. It's a history of the beginning of morality, and that's what I relate to. I can't imagine not being Jewish. Just can't imagine it.
And you don't believe in God?
I don't believe in God. I don't like to tell too many people that, but I don't. I mean, people tend to get shocked by that, so I don't discuss it very openly.
But for you, Judaism doesn't, that's not an essential part of being Jewish.
No. I think as a Reformed Jew, I think it's allowed. Now, I wouldn't, it's very interesting because I've been to services at Beth Adam, or I've seen services conducted by, and I hate it when they don't say things in Hebrew or they don't say the Kaddish. I like ritual. I like the history, and I like ritual.
My own Jewish identity is clearly influenced by the legacy of the German Jewish community and the classical reform movement in Cincinnati. Although I don't celebrate Christmas or Easter, I am an assimilated Jew. When I was growing up, my grandmother had a Christmas tree. The services I attended were mostly in English and featured a choir full of Christians, and my congregation had very few members, if any, who wore yarmulke, or talit. I attended religious school, held on and known as Sunday school, and was bat mitzvahed, but I know no more Yiddish than the average Christian. And like my German Jewish ancestors, I am familiar with only the most common Hebrew prayers. Yet I claim my Jewish identity as proudly as those who come from more traditional Jewish upbringings. Like the Eastern European side of my family, my German Jewish ancestors have a long and proud history of involvement with the Jewish community. My paternal great-grandfather played a part in the beginnings of Hebrew Union College. My grandfather was an early Reform Zionist who led the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, and my father worked throughout his life for Jewish causes. But their dedication didn't stop there. They were also actively involved in the larger communities in Cincinnati. Understanding both sides of my family has taught me that Jewish identity is fluid, complex, and broader than most people care to admit. The differences between the Eastern European and the German Jewish communities may have been more pronounced in Cincinnati, but prejudice and class warfare are unfortunate byproducts of almost every immigrant story. Fortunately, as the years pass by, the details and the divisions fade away, and the differences so prevalent in the lives of past generations become part of a story about a community and its influence on subsequent generations. Like any story, it has its ups and its downs, but knowing it has made me better understand who I am today.
How do you feel about being Jewish?
I'm very proud of being Jewish. I've been wearing a, what's this thing called?
Don't do that again, because all I hear is...
Okay, we'll try that again. It's a Mogen David.
Mogen David.
Isn't that wine? Oh, you better ask me that again.
How do you feel about being Jewish?
I'm very proud of being Jewish. I've been wearing a Star of David.